I'm very happy to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Emman El-Badawy, or Emma. She's the director of the Extremism Policy Unit of the very important Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And she's a very regular participant in all of our UK-Israel strategic dialogues that we hold every year with Chatham House. She shapes the Institute's research and policy agenda on security and extremism, and she specializes in the Middle East, political Islam, Islamist movements, and counter-terrorism. She is also a fellow of the British Academy and the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I will go with Emman from now. Emman, please, as we reflect on 20 years after 9/11, and I think everybody has been following all of the different speeches, and there's been a lot of documentaries, really interesting ones going around. How would you assess how the war on terror is going, kind of looking back in the past and like briefly?
Thanks, Pascaline, and hello to everybody, and Happy New Year as well. Shana Tova, I think that's the correct thing to say. Yes. Do tell me if that's the wrong pronunciation. It's a real pleasure to be doing this, and I've been working closely with ELNET as part of the UK delegation for the Israel Dialogues, as you mentioned, Pascaline, and it's always been really eye-opening and an excellent experience. I'm really grateful to be able to give something back to ELNET for all the amazing strategy meetings that they've hosted. As you mentioned, I work for the Tony Blair Institute, and it was inevitable that we would be working to mark the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. It was always going to be an important one. And when I thought about how we would be marking it, I actually was thinking about it back in 2019, maybe you could say end of 2018. I knew it would be an important moment. And this would have been before the deal with the Taliban, the US deal with the Taliban that was signed in February 2020. And so at that point, certainly I was thinking there would be a moment to really think about how the terrorist threat has evolved in the last 20 years since 9/11 and how the war on terror has fared. And for sure, there's a lot to say about that, which I'll say a little bit about it. But I think also coming into the sort of the beginning of this year, we also had the terrorist threat obviously evolving, but also the rise of the far-right extremism, which could not be ignored, especially with the storming of the Capitol Hill. I think many people who are experts in Islamist terrorism were starting to look at the parallel, or maybe not so parallel, threat of right-wing extremism and understanding how that will play into the sort of next 20 years of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. Also, of course, COVID and the pandemic dramatically changed the psyche of the world, I think, in a way that you could draw parallels with 9/11 in a sense. I think many people in the counterterrorism industry, you could say, were looking at counterterrorism as under threat in terms of there's now something maybe more important from a national security perspective. Global pandemics, for example, could really affect and see much bigger death counts than a terrorist incident could. And I think this was really an important one for people in the counterterrorism space to understand that there are now bigger priorities potentially for countries to deal with, and that the world was going to be having to deal with constrained budgets as well, and where would counterterrorism sit on that. So I think always the 9/11 anniversary this year was going to be a challenging one for those who understood the terrorism threat and needed to make sure that terrorism stayed high, if not at the top, of the international security agenda. Of course, then when the signing of the deal with the Taliban, and then later with Biden's inauguration and the decision to attach the withdrawal, the full withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, there was a sort of sense attaching it to the anniversary date, September 11. I think there was a real sense that this was going to become a really big, important moment for the Western world to reflect on what we had achieved. What we didn't expect, of course, was the horrifying scenes that we have seen in the last 20 to 30 days or so. in Afghanistan, where it has definitely tainted the sense that the war on terror has been an abject failure. And I think that's where my first point is to say, yes, of course, the terrorist threat has proliferated. It has metastasized. We have almost, you could estimate now 100 different Islamist terrorist groups, organizations, factions operating around the world. We can actually mark at least 60 countries that are being affected directly or indirectly from the threat of Islamist terrorist groups operative in the world today. And that means having had either an attack orchestrated on civilians in their country, or having had the attacks orchestrated from those countries. And so that just shows the scale of the threat and how it has proliferated in the last 20 years. And I think from anyone looking at it logically would be easily able to say, that would say that the war on terror has not succeeded, if that is how you would define victory and success in the war on terror as we've come to understand it. And I think that's where the problem lies, is of course we see the themes of what's happening in Afghanistan, but I think when we look back at the last 20 years, it really has to be shaped in terms of what did people understand the war on terror to be? Was it a conventional war, just because we use the terminology of a war? Could we expect conventional scenes of sort of victory moments? I think when you look back at the speeches of 2001, I think many people in this call will have known and remember it probably far more than I could at the time when I was at my age. But having studied it and looked back at the history and taken a long view, it was abundantly clear that at least the rhetoric recognized this was going to be multi-generational, it was going to be a lengthy campaign, it wasn't going to be a quick victory moment. And while the rhetoric was there, I don't think it was particularly understood that this was actually the reality. That yes, you could go into Iraq, or you could go into Afghanistan, you could have clear goals on what you're trying to achieve. And maybe then you could start to see conventional signs of victory. But actually, just because terrorist threats would crop up in different parts of the world as well, didn't mean that that the overall counter-terrorism effort was failing. I think understanding what containment means and what, I think 2011 was a major turning point. You saw troops withdraw from Iraq. It left a vacuum, a political vacuum, and then also a security vacuum. But then also we had the Arab Spring, even though as well in the same year you had the killing of Osama bin Laden, which symbolically at least was seen as a success for the war on terror. And so I think we look back certainly the last 10 years and we think potentially we lost track of what we were trying to achieve there. We didn't anticipate the conditions evolving in the Middle East and working in the favor of terrorist groups. And I remember 2011 very, very well. I remember many very respected experts looking at this as almost like a post-jihadist world, that it was proving that you could make major changes in the political systems of the Middle East and challenge authoritarianism through peaceful means. And that obviously, as we all know, quickly changed. And the Arab Spring obviously was not a spring at all. And I think that was a major boon to many jihadist factions, as we've seen. And I don't think Western foreign policy caught up. They were still scarred from the previous 10 years of interventions and maybe misplaced sense of victories and failures.
You spoke about like let's now move to the present, and recently you mentioned the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which we've all followed and saw the images. And we've seen also the Europeans reacting in their own way, the Brits, the French. We've seen some emotional speeches about military colleagues, and there's and a very bad feeling of how things are evolving. We've seen talks about Europe, again, kind of like a wake-up call, going forward with the thoughts of strategic autonomy and trying to develop their own defense, etc. So How is Europe digesting this withdrawal, and what changes do you foresee from the Europeans?
I think the European nations they have a lot to face at the moment. At least immediately, their focus has been on the humanitarian aspect and the big question of whether they take in Afghan refugees and what challenges that's going to pose. And I think there are a lot of internal debates, domestic debates that are incredibly tense around those issues because it connects with sort of debates around immigration. And that's, of course, going to be one of the most immediate issues for European nations as they deal with the withdrawal and the implications of the withdrawal. I think they have the challenge definitely within the humanitarian aspect of whether or not to engage and negotiate with the Taliban, and certainly whether or not to recognize the Taliban. And I think there is a little bit of floundering, not just with European nations, but generally across the board in Western nations and their allies in terms of how to deal with this. And it's almost remarkable because you almost assume that nobody had warned that this was going to happen or that this could happen. And it was clear as day, and many top analysts and experts had warned that a withdrawal of the kind that we were expecting from May onwards would result in a resurgence of the Taliban, and we would have to figure out what our political will was to negotiate or work with the Taliban. But that seems to be something that still hasn't got quite a lot of coherent plan. And I think that's going to be something, as we look over the next sort of couple of weeks, it's going to be the major priority for European nations is to figure out a policy in order to engage. But I think broadly, there are really big generational strategic questions that the European nations are now having to face. And a lot of it is down to really thinking about its relationship with the United States, its relationship both as a bloc of European countries, the European Union, as well as its relationships bilaterally with the US, and what the scope is for a European Union that can make policies autonomously from US, especially when it comes to missions that are in its interests. And so when we recognize the immigration challenges that are posed to European nations and the refugee crisis, and they obviously have scars still from the 2015 refugee crisis that emerged from Syria, and the domestic politics are increasingly shaped by those issues. They can't afford to not have a clear policy, and they probably would like to have member states operate more independently and make decisions on their own behalf other than work as a bloc. But I think that the scale of the issues that Afghanistan and the withdrawal poses, it will require much more talking together and figuring out a coherent plan, and that includes actually with the UK. The UK is in exactly the same boat, I would say, as most of the European Union countries, and they are having to really think about what is the scope of, even I've seen some talk around a European Union army that would fill the gap of a retreating United States, and whether there is interest in that. And there has been across the board, I think, some murmurings over even recent years, long actually before this situation we've seen with Afghanistan, around what could a European army look like, or some sort of military force in place of an absent United States. What does the European Union relationship with NATO look like, and how can that be changed? And so this is what I mean by some of the really big generational strategic questions for the European Union. And I think gone are the days where the European Union can be almost at the back seat of this, or just sort of symbolically assisting missions. If they want the missions, I think they're going to have to offer up a lot more than what they have in the past. And I think that's been a real bone of contention for the US over the years, and has led obviously to the rather nationalist America first narratives that we've seen. Obviously Biden has America's back, but so far the policies don't seem to be that different. And so I think this is going to be years in the making, actually, this debate, and it'll be interesting to see what leadership emerges, especially with Germany facing a leadership change as well. new generation of leaders, what, where do they sit in terms of the role European nations can either should ideologically or philosophically play, and also how they can realistically play a role as well. And this is all at a time where actually many European nations are dealing with their own struggles of post-COVID and the sort of budgetary constraints as well.
Enough on all of our plates, indeed. You touched upon this very briefly in the beginning. You mentioned jihadist groups, 100 different groups, 60 countries involved around the world. Can you maybe a little bit elaborate on the jihadi movement today, and how does the Afghanistan withdrawal impact them?
Yeah, so you've heard, I'm sure, many people speaking about how this will inevitably, the withdrawal and the scenes that we've seen of the United States and its allies retreating from Afghanistan, how it will be such a propaganda win for jihadists around the world. I mean, even as we were watching, the world was laser focused on the Afghanistan situation. In parallel to that, we were having terrorist attacks happening all over the world by Islamist groups. So you had attacks by Boko Haram and along the Lake Chad Basin in Nigeria during the days of the chaos in Afghanistan. You had Al-Shabaab claiming its 54th attack after a 9-day campaign in Somalia. You had propaganda by Islamist Al-Qaeda related groups in the Philippines and in Indonesia, inciting violence against Western and government officials in the region. And they're increasing their sort of call for lone wolf acts. And these have just continued over time. And we've been watching and tracking the propaganda and the statements that have been made by different Islamist groups. And I would say that it's a hard place to find a terrorist organization, an Islamist terrorist organization, that hasn't commented on the Taliban resurgence and hasn't commended the Taliban for it. I think many groups are starting to look at it as an its sort of inspiration to what they're trying to achieve. Not all of them. So there are, of course, major splits that we've been witnessing in the jihadist movement at the moment. It's not a monolithic movement. You guys will know that really well. We have, of course, the competition and rivalry between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You also have that rivalry that you're seeing at the moment in Afghanistan with ISIS and the Taliban. But it's across the board, and it's ideological as well as operational. And so whilst you have some groups, for example, Al-Shabaab, HTS, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, they'll see these, the Taliban and what the Taliban has done, maybe even Al-Qaeda in Mali, so that's JNIM, that's based in Mali at the moment. These are groups that kind of consider themselves to be pragmatic, and they definitely look at the Taliban as a sort of example to what they're trying to achieve on the ground. They have expressed an interest in negotiating with the international community to basically find some sort of agreement to put down arms and to have some sort of truce. Whether or not you really believe this, or whether or not you think that negotiation is the right move, incidentally, I do not, but that's obviously another debate altogether. Many jihadist groups, including the three I mentioned, are increasingly looking at more pragmatic ways to get victory on the ground. And so they'll look to the Taliban and they'll see it as, this shows that even the United States will do deals. And if we offer it to them, and if we apply enough pressure on the ground operationally, we may be able to actually have recognized territory in the eyes of the international community. On the other hand, there are jihadist groups today who consider that to be it's a reason to be basically challenging the credibility of these groups, and that it's completely wrong that jihadist groups are willing to even acknowledge or engage with the international community. And those, of course, are groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, etc. And ISIS will continue to consider itself the only true purist jihadist organization because it does not recognize the international community and will not do deals. And so that even in some ways that what's happened in Afghanistan is likely to majorly shift the jihadist movement, in a way where you'll start to see those cleavages that we've seen previously in terms of strategic or tactical differences. They're going to widen because there are going to be some terrorist organizations that are just focused on more nihilistic, destructive ambitions, and there are others that are very keen to establish some sort of credibility, at least in the eyes of local communities and populations. And they tend to be the jihadist organizations who have been showing off their proto-state ambitions. They've been inspired a little bit by the caliphate that ISIS declared in 2014, that has actually been in the makings actually for longer than 2014. It's been a general sort of development of jihadist organizations. They're not just focusing on terrorist attacks, they're not just simply death cults, they're also sustaining territory, they're administering territories, not in a very good way, certainly not, but they're filling vacuums politically as well as security-wise. And this has made counter-terrorism increasingly more complex for governments and for coalition forces trying to deal with it, because it really brings into the whole issue of counterinsurgency in hearts and minds, not just as simple as, you know, droning or using over the horizon capabilities and thinking that will do the problem. But the lines are blurring, and so these terrorist organizations will look to what's happened in Afghanistan and see some sort of benefit of that in terms of how they might be able to curry favor with local communities. And I think many struggling governments in Africa, for example, or Middle East, are going to be looking at this and really panicking, because what they don't want is unilateral pressure from the international community to start negotiating with terrorists that they have been fighting for decades. In fact, long before 2001, it is an existential threat to many of these governments, and to have the pressure to start to engage with their terrorist groups that have been launching insurgencies for generations, I think is going to start posing some real problems for them. And I think that's what we're facing now with the threat. It's evolved. The jihadist movement is splintering. It will create a new generation of terrorists. And as you have more pragmatists, you will also have more extremists. And that's what you're going to have. You're just going to have a polarization of tactics. And unfortunately, I think civilian casualties will be the reality of that as they start to outbid each other.
I want to take this a little bit closer to home for us here in Israel, because we've seen similar reactions from terror groups around here in the close neighborhood, so Hamas and Hezbollah. So maybe could you elaborate a little bit about those? I know that in general, the new Israeli government is now looking into actually negotiating with Hamas for kind of peace and quiet versus better conditions in Gaza. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of their comments around the Taliban, of course, Hezbollah has commented on the resurgence of the Taliban. Generally as they've talked about a force for anti-colonialism, and this is a victory for removing the colonial states in Afghanistan and in the Muslim countries. So very kind of pan-Islamic type of commentary that you would expect of a group like Hezbollah. It's been relatively quiet very recently, and I think that's to do with Iran's strategy. It's been slightly murky, and we're kind of currently watching what's going on with how Iran is engaging with the Taliban. And I can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. Hamas, we haven't picked up on I'm trying to think of the long list that we had as we were capturing all the bits. We've seen a lot of the Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have been very vocal. But Hamas has not really made much comment about the Taliban resurgence, and if they have, I've missed it. But what I would say is that this question of negotiations and whether to negotiate with these groups really comes down to how you see the jihadist and Islamist movement as coherent or not. Of course, I think we've learned a lot about the sort of differences between violent and non-violent Islamist groups, and Hamas has always posed a challenging case study, as well as Hezbollah, because they have administered territories. And I guess, you know, back in the early 2000s, that made them really, really different from other jihadist terrorist groups, because they had political ambitions. That is not making them different anymore. This is something that has been strategically developing across the jihadist movement. We saw it with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, also in the early 2000s, where they were operating to try to administer resources for people locally, in terms of water access, access to food and medicine. And so we have to start updating our understanding of what differentiates these groups and what marks Hamas and Hezbollah, for example, from other jihadist groups, because I think that is what a lot of the international community has marked these two groups as different, is their state ambitions, their state-led ambitions. And I think one of the things we have to be very cautious of is not oversimplifying that. When we look to what's happening to Afghan people who have made real gains in their country over the last 20 years, and everyone has been horrified to see Afghans hold onto US aircrafts because of the desperation of living under Islamist rule. We have to understand that that's been the reality for many people living in Gaza, and it's not that different. Yes, there are political motivations for supporting Hamas in Gaza, and maybe those decisions are slightly more complex and we have to understand them more. But I think the international community now, really, this is showing the need to understand the threat, understand the enemy. Don't debate semantically over really unnecessary things, and understand why liberals and progressives have to be resilient against these ideologies and these movements. I can understand you'd have to negotiate. I think this is exactly the same thing that we're having with Taliban. You've got to negotiate with the de facto government or leading figures that are controlling the territories in order to provide humanitarian assistance. And this is the moral debate of our time when it comes to the Islamist threat. And I think it has a place, because I think it shows the superiority of Western liberal values. And I think that's where it should be understood. But it should also be done in such a way that we're not recognizing or legitimizing these people and these figures. I think that has been one of the big challenges, and it will continue to be the biggest challenge, I think.
So I feel like you've already partially answered the next question. I think it's we're moving into it quite naturally. So moving forward, can Europe and the US develop a more successful strategy to address the terrorist threats? And what should be the focus in Europe? Like, you have the homegrown terrorism, and at the same time, we also need to focus them on the Middle East. So what should be their policies towards the Middle East? Very wide questions.
That is a wide question. I'm sure lots of people on the line probably have a lot of thoughts on this, because I think this is going to be the big debates. I can already see some upcoming elections where this is going to be a really big debate, for example, in France. One of the things I've been thinking about more and more is the state of domestic politics in Western countries and across the board, UK, Europe, United States. We have a really big problem in the political left around their understanding of Islamism. And I think this is going to need to be urgently addressed if we are going to come to a point where we can formulate certainly a counter-terrorism strategy, but also a Middle East strategy, foreign policy strategy that can work in tandem with one another. I'm fascinated about this growing, not necessarily conscious all the time, but it's certainly palpable, growing left Islamist alliance in domestic politics in Western countries across Europe, UK and United States. And I look at a lot of the debates within the Democrat Party, Biden's administration, And I do see a lot of the issues that have been called out in some European countries. I'm talking Macron here, where they have spoken about some of the apologetics around Islamism and not necessarily recognizing Islamism. I think the political left is so deeply afraid of being accused of Islamophobia, especially when we have a rise of the far right, and it is increasingly becoming a problem that is homegrown. And with this desire not to be seen as Islamophobic, they are therefore ending up, in some ways, carrying very deeply Orientalist views of Muslim societies and Muslim people. And it, maybe not intentionally, they have done away with their role of being the progressive voices in Western policymaking. So much so that many policies, I believe, are heading towards being deeply regressive in the interests of Muslim people. And yes, there will always be pressures to be inclusive and not to demonize Muslim Europeans, European Muslims, British Muslims, etc. But I think that there is a lot of expertise now that is homegrown expertise. So British Westerners, Muslim Westerners who know the difference between religion as Islam as a religion, as a faith, a personal faith, and Islamism as a political ideology that is totalitarian and is a perversion of the Islamic fundamental texts that many Muslims adhere to and respect. And so I think there's a lot of work generationally for the political left in the West to take that role and understand the division between Islam and Islamists and Muslims and Islamist terrorists. And I think that is going to be a rather painful process, but I hope that can be resolved generationally with a new sort of set of young, progressive, left-leaning voices. But I think that recent situations that increasingly, for example, issues around colonialism, Black Lives Matter, these have just made culture wars, these have just made these topics increasingly more emotional and sensitive than ever before. And I think that could slow things down in terms of getting progress around the understanding of Islamism and why it's a threat. But I do think very influential voices need to start speaking out and increasingly educating people in the West. And until that happens, I think there's going to be more debate than consensus over what we're dealing with. And it'll come up with debates around whether military interventions do more harm than good, the role the West should be playing abroad, whether it's in their interests to secure liberties and freedoms abroad. And to me, I feel like it's just such wasted energy. And the sooner we can resolve these debates, the better, because it's just working into the hands of the jihadist groups and the Islamist groups who have long sought to distort these identities for their own benefits.